On the scaffold, in 1585, William Parry was disemboweled while still breathing, protesting incessantly that the Queen knew he was innocent. This was the highest price ever paid in the history of British intelligence for a clumsy charade. Parry had posed as an assassin to prove his loyalty, but he played the role so convincingly that Elizabeth I believed he truly intended to kill her. Parry's fatal error was his overconfidence in entering a private chamber, drawing a dagger, and telling the Queen that he could strike right now, but chose to stop. He presented this as proof of his devotion, but to the most suspicious woman in England, it was a direct threat. From that moment, the fate of this loyal spy was sealed by the very paranoia he had inadvertently triggered. He was born William ap Parry in Northup, Flintshire, in the rugged, rain-swept country of North Wales. The exact year of his birth is lost to the mists of parish records, but the circumstances of his family are the stuff of local legend. His father, Harry ap David, was a figure of almost mythological proportion. A man of immense physical strength and vitality, he had served in the royal guard of King Henry VIII, a position reserved for the tallest and most imposing men of the kingdom. But Harry's legacy was not martial, it was reproductive. He lived to the staggering, almost impossible age of 108. Over the course of that century of life, he fathered 30 children. There were 14 children from his first marriage and 16 from his second, to William's mother. William was born into the second brood, arriving into a world that was already overflowing. One must imagine the psychological environment of the A.P. Harry household. It was a small, likely chaotic dwelling, dominated by a centenarian patriarch who refused to die and a constantly expanding brood of siblings. In such a house, resources were finite. Attention was scarce. Food was a competition. It was a Darwinian nursery that taught young William his first and most enduring lesson: survival depends on being noticed. In a family of 30, the quiet child starves. The obedient child is ignored. To survive, William learned to be louder, faster, and more manipulative than the mob surrounding him. He learned that if you wanted something, you could not simply ask for it. You had to take it or trick someone else into giving it to you. This childhood hunger for food, for status, for distinction would never leave him. It became the engine of his life. Despite the crowded conditions, the family possessed a certain rough respectability and enough pooled resources to secure William an education. They saw his sharp mind, his quick grasp of language, and his aversion to manual labor. They scraped together the funds to apprentice him to a lawyer named Fisher in the city of Chester. It was a golden ticket. For a boy from Northup, a legal apprenticeship was a guaranteed path to a stable, middle-class existence. He could have become a clerk, a scrivener, perhaps eventually a minor official with a warm hearth and a steady income. But to William, the dusty ledgers of Chester, the scratching quills, and the gray future of a provincial clerk seemed like a cage. Rejecting the path of respectability, he sought something more magnificent. Sometime in the early 1560s, he ran away. He abandoned his apprenticeship, severed his ties with the crowded house in Flintshire, and fled to the magnet of all ambitious souls, London. His arrival in the capital marked his first great act of reinvention. The Welsh name A.P. Harry, son of Harry, was discarded. It sounded too rustic, too provincial. He anglicized it, smoothing the edges until it became Parry. With this simple linguistic shift, the Welsh farm boy was erased and the London aspirant was born. Elizabethan London was a city of sensory overload, a place of extreme squalor and breathtaking wealth. It was a city where a man without a pedigree could rise if he had enough bravery, the Tudor term for ostentatious display. Parry looked around and realized that the quickest way to wealth was not through the slow drudgery of the law, but through the strategic acquisition of a wife. Parry was handsome in a rough-hewn way, articulate, and possessed a charm that could disarm the wary. He styled himself as a gentleman of great but temporarily embarrassed prospects. He went hunting. His prey was the widow. In the 16th century, widows were unique figures in the legal landscape. They were often the only women who possessed independent control over their finances. Parry located a Mrs. Powell, the widow of a wealthy gentleman and the daughter of Sir William Thomas. She was rich. He was penniless. Through sheer force of personality, he wooed her, married her, and immediately took control of her fortune. Under the law of coverture, a woman's property became her husband's upon marriage. Parry did not view this as a stewardship. He viewed it as a plunder. He had a hole in his hand, as the contemporary saying went. He did not invest Mrs. Powell's money in land or trade. He wore it. Historical records indicate he spent lavishly on clothes, velvet doublets, silk hose, jeweled daggers. He wanted to walk down Cheapside and have the merchants mistake him for a lord. He sought to externalize the nobility he claimed to possess. He burned through Mrs. Powell's fortune with frightening speed. When she died shortly after their union, he did not mourn. He reloaded. He set his sights on Catherine Haywood, another wealthy widow. The cycle repeated itself with grim predictability. He charmed, he married, he seized her assets, and he poured them into the bottomless pit of his own vanity. But this time, there were consequences. Catherine had children from a previous marriage, and they were not so easily charmed. Parry's aggressive seizure of his wife's properties led to brutal, protracted legal battles. He spent years in the Court of Chancery, fighting over lands in Lincolnshire and Woolwich. He was a nightmare litigant, stubborn, deceptive, and convinced of his own righteousness. But the courts are expensive, and the bravery was unpaid for. By 1580, the facade was cracking. The money from the widows was gone. The debts were mounting. William Parry was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was beginning to crumble beneath his velvet shoes. The crisis arrived in the form of a man named Hugh Hare. Hugh Hare was a terrifying figure in his own right, a sharp-eyed lawyer and a relentless moneylender. Parry had borrowed heavily from him to fund his lifestyle, signing bonds and surety with the reckless abandon of a man who never intended to pay. The principal debt was £610, a massive sum in 1580, enough to purchase a small manor house or a ship. But Parry had defaulted again and again. With interest, penalties, and legal fees, the debt had spiraled to over £1,000. Hugh Hare was done waiting. He prepared the legal writs to have Parry arrested for debt. In Elizabethan England, this was a death sentence in slow motion. Debtors were thrown into prisons like the Fleet or the Marshalsea. These were not correctional facilities. They were holding pens where men rotted in their own filth, starved or died of jail fever, typhus, while their families begged for coins outside the gates. Parry panicked. The pressure stripped away the veneer of the London gentleman, and the desperate, hungry boy from North Wales re-emerged. On November 2nd, 1580, Parry went to the Inner Temple, the heart of London's legal district. He walked to Hugh Hare's chambers. Finding the door locked, he did not knock. He did not leave a card. He pried out the nail of the latch and burst in. Inside, he found Hare. The confrontation was violent and chaotic. Parry drew a dagger. He screamed at the lawyer, threatening to kill him if the debt wasn't canceled immediately. It was a clumsy, frantic act, the act of a cornered animal. Hare, though terrified, survived the encounter and raised the alarm. Parry was arrested almost immediately. Here is where the nuances of the law trapped him. If Parry had simply beaten Hare in the street, it would have been a charge of assault or battery, serious but survivable. But because he had broken into Hare's private dwelling with the intent to commit a crime, extortion, or murder, the charge was elevated to burglary. In 1580, burglary was a capital offense. William Parry was tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang. He was thrown into Newgate Prison. He sat in the damp darkness, listening to the bells of St. Sepulchre tolling for the condemned, knowing that his vanity had finally killed him. The gentleman was gone. Only the corpse remained. But William Parry had one card left to play. He possessed a superpower that few common criminals had. He knew how to write and he knew how to flatter. From his death cell, he wrote a desperate, eloquent letter to William Cecil, Lord Burghley. Burghley was the Queen's chief minister, the architect of the Elizabethan state, and the most powerful man in England. He was the spy master, the treasurer, and the gatekeeper. Why would such a man care about a bankrupt, violent con artist scheduled for the gallows? Parry's letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. He did not plead innocence. The evidence was too strong. Instead, he pleaded utility. He claimed he was a victim of tragic circumstances, a man of great potential who had been led astray by bad luck. He promised that if his life were spared, he would serve the Queen with the same ferocity he had shown in his private life. He offered his soul to the state. He hinted that a man who had no scruples, no reputation, and no fear was exactly what the government needed. "I am a man," he wrote, "who can go where your lords cannot." Burghley, for reasons that remain a mystery to historians, was intrigued. Perhaps he saw a use for a tool that was already broken. Perhaps he needed an agent who was expendable. Or perhaps he simply admired the sheer audacity of the request. Burghley intervened. He spoke to the Queen. In a move that shocked the legal establishment, Queen Elizabeth granted a royal pardon. William Parry walked out of Newgate Prison blinking in the sunlight. The noose was gone. But he wasn't free. He was now owned by the state. He was a man living on borrowed time, and the interest rate was his absolute obedience. Most men, having escaped the hangman by a miracle, would retreat into a quiet life. They would move to the country, change their name again, and live in humble gratitude. Parry did the opposite. He immediately returned to his old habits. He tried to scam Edward Hoby, Lord Burghley's own nephew, in a fraudulent land deal. It was an act of breathtaking stupidity, a compulsion he could not control. Hoby's mother had to beg Burghley to throw Parry back in jail to stop him. Sitting in the poultry counter prison for the second time, Parry realized he needed to make himself useful again, and fast. He needed a stage bigger than London. He needed a con so large that no one would notice the small debts. He wrote to Burghley again, "Send me abroad. I can be a spy. I can infiltrate the Catholics. I can be your eyes in Rome." The English government was terrified of Catholic plots. The Pope had excommunicated Elizabeth. The Jesuits were smuggling priests into the country. Spain was building an armada. England was a fortress under siege. They needed agents who could walk into Rome, Paris, and Venice and pass as true believers. Who better than William Parry? A man who had spent his life lying. A man who could weep on command. A man who had nothing left to lose. Burghley agreed. In 1582, Parry was released, given a license to travel, and sent to the continent. The burglar was dead. The spy was born. The pardon was signed and the noose was put back in the locker, but William Parry was not a free man. He was a creature of the state, a broken tool that Lord Burghley intended to use until it snapped. Parry had proven he could deceive widows and lawyers in London, but the game was about to change. He was no longer playing for money. He was playing for the security of the realm. With a license to travel and a pocket full of secret instructions, the Welsh burglar boarded a ship for France, leaving his past behind to invent his most dangerous persona yet, the penitent Catholic exile. In the annals of espionage, the year 1582 marks a peculiar turning point. The English Secret Service, under the cold, unblinking direction of Sir Francis Walsingham and Lord Burghley, was evolving from a domestic police force into an international intelligence network. They were learning a fundamental truth of statecraft. If you cannot defeat your enemy on the battlefield, you must destroy them from within. William Parry was their newest weapon. But unlike the professional intelligencers who were trained in cipher breaking and stealth, Parry was an instrument of pure chaos. He was released from the poultry counter prison, dusted off, given a license to travel, and pushed onto a boat bound for France. His mission was vague but terrifyingly dangerous. Infiltrate the community of English Catholic exiles, gain their trust, and report back on their plots against the Queen. For most men, this assignment would be a death sentence. The English exiles in Paris, men like Thomas Morgan and Charles Paget, were paranoid, hardened survivors. They saw spies in every shadow. They knew the face of a traitor. If Parry made one mistake, his body would be found floating in the Seine. But William Parry possessed a psychological advantage that the professional spies lacked. He was a narcissist with a persecution complex. He did not have to act like a man who had been wronged by the English state. He believed he was one. He arrived in Paris in the autumn of 1582. The city was a cauldron of religious violence. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where thousands of Protestants were butchered in the streets, was a fresh memory, less than a decade old. The air smelled of incense and gunpowder. Into this volatile world walked Parry, dressed in somber, travel-stained clothes, carrying the demeanor of a broken man. He went straight to the heart of the conspiracy. He sought out Thomas Morgan, the chief agent of the imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots. Morgan was the spider at the center of the Catholic web, a man who coordinated the flow of money and information between the Vatican, Spain, and the cells of English prisons. Parry's approach was a masterclass in reverse psychology. A standard spy would have tried to blend in, to ask quiet questions. Parry did the opposite. He made a scene. He threw himself at Morgan's feet. He wept openly. He confessed that he was a spy sent by Lord Burghley. This was the double bluff. Parry told Morgan everything. They sent me to destroy you. I am a creature of the heretic queen, but I cannot do it. My conscience is torn. He spun a tale of spiritual crisis. He claimed that although he had taken Burghley's money, his heart had always remained true to the old faith. He spoke of his terror of conscience. He described the guilt that kept him awake at night. He offered to become a double agent, to take Burghley's money but serve the Catholic cause. Thomas Morgan was a cynical man, but Parry's performance was flawless. It was fueled by the genuine resentment Parry felt toward his creditors and his own failures in London. When Parry cried about the injustice of his life, the tears were real. Morgan was seduced. He welcomed the penitent spy into the fold. He began to trust him. For months, Parry lived a double life in Paris. By day, he wrote coded letters to Burghley in London, claiming he was making progress. By night, he drank with the conspirators, listening to their dreams of a Spanish invasion and a Catholic England. But Parry quickly grew bored. The exiles in Paris were all talk. They were bitter men waiting for a check from the King of Spain that never came. Parry wanted action. He wanted to be at the center of the world. And in 1583, the center of the Catholic world was not Paris. It was Venice. He traveled south, crossing the Alps in winter. The journey itself was a metaphor for his life, cold, dangerous, and solitary. He arrived in Venice in early 1583. Venice was the spy capital of the world. It was a city of masks, both literal and metaphorical. The Council of Ten watched everyone. The Inquisition watched the council. It was a place where secrets were the primary currency. Parry felt right at home. Here, he made contact with the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus was the intellectual and spiritual vanguard of the Counter-Reformation. To the English government, they were terrorists. To the Catholics, they were saints. Parry introduced himself to Father Benedetto Palmio, a grave and serious Jesuit scholar. Parry realized that the sob story he used in Paris wouldn't work on a Jesuit. These men were intellectuals. They needed a theological hook. So Parry invented a new persona. He became the Zealot. He told Father Palmio that he was tired of waiting for politics to save England. He argued that Queen Elizabeth was not just a heretic, but a tyrant who was dragging millions of souls to hell. He proposed a radical solution. He began to whisper about the enterprise. In the code of the 16th century, the enterprise of England usually meant a military invasion. But Parry used the word differently. He used it to mean assassination. He tested the waters carefully. He asked Palmio hypothetical questions. Is it lawful to kill a tyrant for the sake of the church? If a man were to sacrifice his own life to remove the Jezebel, would he be damned or saved? Father Palmio was cautious. The Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with regicide. Pope Pius V had excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570, effectively releasing her subjects from obedience, but the Church officially discouraged private individuals from taking matters into their own hands. It was messy. It was bad PR. But Parry was relentless. He pushed harder. He claimed he had access to the Queen. He claimed he could get close enough to strike. He just needed one thing: permission. Why was he doing this? This is the central mystery of William Parry's life. Was he acting as an agent provocateur, trying to trap the Jesuits into endorsing murder so he could send the proof to Burghley? Or was he, in the fevered heat of the Venetian summer, actually considering it? The most likely answer is that Parry was addicted to the game. He was improvising. He wanted to see how far he could push the envelope. He wanted to be the man who held the fate of a nation in his pocket. He was playing both sides against the middle, waiting to see which one offered the better reward. Father Palmio, disturbed but intrigued by this intense Englishman, passed him up the chain of command. He suggested Parry write directly to the Vatican. In late 1583, William Parry sat down at a desk in Venice and wrote the most dangerous letter of his life. It was addressed to Pope Gregory XIII, the Vicar of Christ, the most powerful spiritual leader on earth. The audacity of the act is staggering. Parry was a bankrupt burglar, a known spy, and a man who had sworn an oath to Queen Elizabeth. Yet he took up his quill and addressed the Pope as an equal in the great game. In the letter, Parry declared his absolute submission to the Holy See. He wrote that he had been inspired by God to undertake a holy enterprise for the restitution of the realm of England to the Catholic faith. He did not use the word murder. That would be crude. He used the language of crusaders. He asked for the Pope's blessing. Specifically, he asked for a plenary indulgence. In Catholic theology, a plenary indulgence is the remission of all temporal punishment due to sin. It is a spiritual clean slate. If Parry were to kill the Queen and be executed immediately after, a near certainty, he wanted a guarantee that his soul would bypass purgatory and go straight to heaven. He sealed the letter and gave it to the papal nuncio to send to Rome. Then the waiting began. This was the highest wire act imaginable. If the letter was intercepted by English agents who were not in on the joke, Parry would be tortured to death as a traitor. If the Pope responded with horror and excommunicated him, Parry's cover would be blown. He was betting his life on the cynicism of the Vatican bureaucracy. He moved to Lyon and then back to Paris to wait for the reply. The winter of 1583 was a nervous time. Parry was running out of money again. He was borrowing from other exiles, spinning more lies to keep his creditors at bay. He wrote to Burghley, hinting that he was on the verge of a massive intelligence breakthrough, begging for more funds. Burghley sent scraps, keeping his dog hungry. Then in March 1584, a courier arrived from Rome. He carried a packet sealed with the arms of the Vatican. Parry opened it. Inside was a letter from Cardinal Tolomeo Gallio, the Cardinal of Como, the Pope's Secretary of State. Parry read the Latin text. His hands must have shaken. The cardinal wrote that His Holiness had received Parry's offer with great joy. He praised Parry's zeal. He exhorted him to persevere in his holy purpose. And most importantly, he granted the plenary indulgence. His Holiness, the letter read, grants you his blessing and a plenary indulgence and remission of all your sins, so that you may with the more holy and safe conscience proceed in your enterprise. It was the golden ticket. Parry held in his hands a document that proved, in black and white, that the Vatican was complicit in a plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. It was the ultimate weapon of propaganda. It was the smoking gun that the English government had been seeking for decades. Parry had won. He had conned the Pope. With the cardinal's letter sewn into the lining of his doublet, William Parry turned his face toward England. He was no longer a refugee or a beggar. He was a man bearing a gift of incalculable value. He crossed the Channel in early 1584. As the white cliffs of Dover came into view, Parry must have rehearsed his speech. He knew he was walking into a trap. He had technically committed high treason by soliciting the Pope's blessing for regicide. If Burghley decided to burn him, the letter would just be evidence for the prosecution. But Parry banked on his own charisma. He believed he could explain the joke. He arrived in London and immediately demanded an audience with the Queen. Such was the strange, informal nature of the Elizabethan court and the power of Burghley's patronage that he got it. The scene of the meeting is one of the most bizarre moments in Tudor history. We have William Parry, the son of the Welsh centenarian, the man who broke into a lawyer's house with a knife, standing before Gloriana herself. He knelt. He pulled out the letter from Cardinal Como. He handed it to Elizabeth. "Majesty," he said in effect, "look what I have done for you. I have tricked your greatest enemy. I have proved that the Pope is a murderer." He explained that his entire enterprise, the weeping in Paris, the plotting in Venice, the letter to Rome, was a sting operation. He claimed he had done it to expose the moral rot of the Catholic Church. He swore that he never intended to hurt a hair on her royal head. Elizabeth I was a shrewd woman. She had survived her sister Mary, the Tower, and smallpox. She knew a liar when she saw one. But she also had a dark sense of humor, and she appreciated audacity. She read the letter. She looked at Parry. She did not arrest him. She did not banish him. She smiled. She allowed him to keep the letter. She commended his service. And then she went further. In a move that baffled her advisors, she rewarded the reformed traitor. Parry was granted a pension. Even more shockingly, the Crown supported his candidacy for a seat in Parliament. In the elections of 1584, William Parry, the spy, was elected as the Member of Parliament for the borough of Queenborough in Kent. It was the pinnacle of his life. He had climbed the mountain. He was a gentleman, a lawmaker, and a favorite of the Queen. He had erased the shame of his bankruptcy. He had silenced the ghosts of North Wales. But success is a dangerous drug for a man like Parry. He functioned best in chaos, in the desperate scramble for survival. Stability bored him. Peace terrified him. As he sat on the benches of the House of Commons in late 1584, wearing his fine velvet clothes, Parry should have been content. But he felt the itch again. The money from the pension evaporated almost as soon as it arrived. The applause of the Queen was fading. He looked around the Parliament and saw men who were driven by ideology. Puritans who wanted to purge the church, patriots who wanted a war with Spain. Parry felt superior to them all. He knew the secrets of Europe. He had danced with Jesuits and cardinals. These English country squires seemed small and provincial to him, and deep down the mask was beginning to stick to the face. Parry had spent 2 years pretending to be a persecuted Catholic zealot. He had spent hours in conversation with Jesuits, arguing the righteousness of their cause. He had wept with exiles. You cannot play a role with that level of intensity without it leaving a mark. Was he a Protestant spy pretending to be Catholic? Or had he become a Catholic sympathizer, pretending to be a Protestant MP? The answer came in December 1584, when the House of Commons introduced the Act Against Jesuits, seminary priests, and such other like disobedient persons. It was a piece of legislation designed to unleash total war on the Catholic underground. It proposed that any priest found in England would be guilty of high treason merely for breathing English air. The bill was popular. It was a wave of patriotic fervor. To stand against it was madness. But on December 17th, as the bill was being read, a figure stood up in the House. It was the member for Queenborough. It was William Parry. His face was flushed. His eyes were wild. He did not speak with the measured tone of a politician. He spoke with the fire of a prophet. "This is a measure savoring of treasons," he shouted, his voice echoing off the timber roof. "It is full of blood, danger, and despair to the English subjects of this realm." The House froze. The silence was absolute. Parry continued to rant. He argued that the bill was tyrannical. He argued that it would drive loyal Catholics to desperation. He sounded exactly like the men he had supposedly been spying on in Paris. He had broken character, or perhaps for the first time in his life he had stepped out of character and spoken the truth. He had forgotten that he was playing a part. He had forgotten that he was William Parry, the survivor. He had become William Parry, the savior. The reaction of the government was instantaneous. The House erupted in fury. "Traitor!" they screamed. "Papist!" Parry was dragged to the bar of the House. He was forced to kneel. He was expelled from the chamber and thrown into custody. As the door of the sergeant-at-arms cell slammed shut, Parry must have realized what he had done. He had just committed political suicide. He had thrown away the Queen's favor, the pension, and the protection of the state. Why? Perhaps he thought he was untouchable. Perhaps he thought the Queen, who had laughed at his trick with the Pope, would appreciate his boldness in Parliament. Perhaps he thought he was the only one smart enough to see the geopolitical chessboard. Or perhaps the shapeshifter had finally lost control of the shape. The queen was confused. She sent word to have him released the next day, assuming he had been drunk or temporarily insane. She gave him one last chance to apologize and return to the fold, but the damage was done. The eyes of the court were now cold. Lord Burghley, who had saved him from the gallows once, looked at Parry and saw a liability. The great game has rules, and Parry had broken the most important one: never embarrass your master. For a brief, shining moment, William Parry had it all. He had conned the Pope, charmed the Queen, and secured a seat in the highest court of the land. He was safe. But safety was a condition Parry's psyche could not tolerate. The outburst in Parliament was not just a political error, it was a psychological collapse. Stripped of his status, expelled from the warmth of the court, and hunted once again by debt, Parry found himself back in the cold. He needed a new scheme, a new partner, and a new way to force the world to pay attention to him. He found all three in the shadows of London. In the frozen January of 1585, London was a city of whispers. The expulsion of William Parry from the House of Commons had been a public spectacle, a sudden and violent fall from grace that left the capital bewildered. Was he a hero? A madman? A secret Catholic? Parry walked the streets a marked man. He had lost his seat, his access to the court, and most dangerously, the protection of Lord Burghley. His creditors, sensing weakness like sharks sensing blood in the water, began to circle again. He was destitute. Desperate men seek desperate company. And in the shadowy margins of the Elizabethan court, Parry found the perfect mirror for his own resentment. He sought out Sir Edmund Neville. Neville was a man haunting the edges of power, consumed by a grievance that ate at his soul. He was the cousin of the exiled rebel Charles Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland. By rights of blood, Edmund claimed the title of Lord Latimer and the vast lands that came with it. But the Queen, wary of the treacherous Neville bloodline, refused to recognize his claim. She kept him in a state of suspended animation, noble by birth, impoverished by decree. Parry and Neville were natural allies. They were both almost men. They were both outsiders looking in at the warmth of the fire they were forbidden to touch. Parry began to groom Neville. It was a courtship of sedition. He visited Neville at his lodgings. He invited him to dinner. He spoke at first in vague terms about the ingratitude of the state. He probed Neville's wounds, agreeing that the Queen had treated him shamefully. "It is a hard world for men of ancient blood," Parry would say, watching Neville's reaction closely. "The new men, the upstarts, they take everything, and we are left to beg." Neville listened. He was younger, less experienced, and starving for validation. In Parry, he saw a sophisticated traveler, a man who had known the Pope, a man who had sat in Parliament. He didn't see the desperation. He saw a mentor. The turning point came when Parry introduced a third party to their conversations: a book. It was a defense of English Catholics, written by William Allen, the leader of the English exiles in France. This book was radioactive. Possession of it was a felony. It argued with cold theological precision that Queen Elizabeth was a tyrant, a heretic, and a usurper. It argued that to remove her was not a sin, but a duty owed to God. Parry brought the book to Neville. He read passages aloud. "Observe," Parry said, tapping the page. "Dr. Allen proves that a prince who abandons God may be abandoned by his people. Is she not a tyrant? Has she not stripped you of your earldom? Has she not driven me from the Parliament?" He was radicalizing Neville. He was using the same techniques the Jesuits used: but with a twisted personal spin. He wasn't trying to save Neville's soul. He was trying to bind Neville to him in a pact of blood. Then Parry played his ace. He produced the letter from Cardinal Como. The physical prop was essential to the con. The red seal, the Latin script, the signature of the Pope's Secretary of State. It lent an air of supreme authority to Parry's ramblings. "I have the mandate," Parry whispered. "The Pope himself has blessed the enterprise. If we strike, we do not sin. We fly straight to heaven." Neville was terrified, but he was also mesmerized. The idea of killing the Queen, the sun around which their entire universe revolved, was almost impossible to conceive. It was like planning to kill gravity. But Parry made it sound like a bureaucratic inevitability. Throughout late January and early February 1585, the two men walked the wet gardens of London, plotting the death of Elizabeth I. Or were they? This is where the story enters the Hall of Mirrors. The historical records of their conversations come almost entirely from their later confessions, extracted under the shadow of the rack. But even through the filter of interrogation, a strange picture emerges. Parry was the architect of the scenarios. He spun them out like a playwright, pitching scenes. "We could take her in the park," he suggested. "She rides with few guards. You have a horse, I have a horse. We could ride up to the coach, discharge our pistols, and gallop for the coast. A boat waits at the Thames estuary." Then he would change the script. "No, the park is too open. I have access to the privy chamber. She trusts me still. I could go to her for a private audience. I could hide a dagger in my sleeve. When she leans forward to hear my petition, it is done." He described the violence with a detached clinical air. But then, in the very next breath, Parry would pull back. He would tell Neville about his hesitation. He recounted a moment when he had been alone with the Queen, knife in hand, ready to strike. "Every time I resolve to do it," Parry confessed, his voice trembling with theatrical emotion, "I look upon her face. Her brightness daunts me. She has the eyes of her father, King Henry. I cannot lift my hand." This hesitation was the key to Parry's psychology. He wanted the credit for being a dangerous assassin, but he didn't want the guilt of the act. He wanted to be the man who could kill the Queen, but chose not to out of mercy. He was casting himself as the tragic hero of his own melodrama. But Neville didn't understand the performance. He took Parry literally. He believed Parry was a coiled snake, waiting for the moment to strike. And Neville realized that if Parry struck and failed, Neville would be dragged down with him. The prisoner's dilemma began to weigh on Sir Edmund Neville. He knew the rules of treason. If two men plot, the first one, to the authorities, gets a pardon. The second one gets the axe. On February 8, 1585, the nerve of Edmund Neville broke. He did not go to Parry, he went to the court. He sought out a man he could trust, a courtier with access to the inner circle. He spilled everything. He told them about the walks in the garden. He told them about Dr. Allen's book. He told them about the assassination scenarios, the coach, the barge, the dagger in the sleeve. And he told them about the letter from the Pope. The reaction of the government was electric. The timing could not have been worse for Parry. The court was already in a state of high anxiety. The Protestant leader William the Silent had just been assassinated in the Netherlands by a Catholic fanatic. The fear of a copycat killing in England was at fever pitch. Sir Francis Walsingham, the spy master, took charge. He didn't arrest Parry immediately. That would be too clumsy. Walsingham was a man who liked to give a traitor enough rope to hang himself. He summoned Parry to his house. The meeting between Walsingham and Parry is a study in contrasting styles. Walsingham was dark, quiet, and infinitely patient. Parry was loud, boastful, and jittery. Walsingham played dumb. He asked Parry casually if he had heard of any new plots against the Queen. He gave Parry an opening. If Parry had been a loyal spy, this was the moment to say, yes, I have been testing Edmund Neville, and I believe he is dangerous. But Parry didn't take the bait. He was arrogant. He thought he was smarter than Walsingham. He denied knowing anything. He claimed the Catholic underground was quiet. He lied. Walsingham nodded slowly. He dismissed Parry. Parry walked out of Walsingham's house thinking he had won the encounter. He went to his lodgings, perhaps to drink wine and celebrate his cleverness. That night the soldiers came. They did not take him to the local jail. They took him to the Tower of London. Parry was shocked. He demanded to see Lord Burghley. He demanded to see the Queen. He shouted that he was a member of Parliament, forgetting he had been expelled. He shouted that he was a royal agent. But the gates of the tower shut with a finality that silenced even William Parry. He was placed in a cell and left to stew. The psychological pressure was immense. Parry knew what happened in the tower. He knew about the rack, the scavenger's daughter, and the manacles. He knew that Walsingham did not ask questions unless he already knew the answers. The interrogation began the next day. Walsingham didn't need to torture Parry physically. He tortured him with facts. He laid out Neville's confession. He detailed the conversations. He quoted Parry's own words back to him. You said you would kill her in the garden. You said her brightness daunted you. You showed the cardinal's letter. Parry crumpled. The confidence man's facade shattered. He began to weep. He began to talk. But even in his confession, Parry tried to spin the story. He admitted the conversations, yes. He admitted the plotting, yes. But he claimed it was all a ruse. I was testing him, Parry cried. I was doing my duty as a spy. I wanted to see if Neville was a traitor, so I tempted him. I was going to report him to the Queen next week. You have arrested the wrong man. I am the hero. It was the same defense he had used in Paris. It was the same defense he had used with the Pope. I am lying to tell the truth. But this time, nobody was buying it. Lord Burghley, his old patron, washed his hands of him. The Queen, who had once found him amusing, was now furious. The idea that a man she had pardoned, a man she had promoted, was discussing her murder in cold blood was unforgivable. Parry was abandoned. He was alone in the dark, with only his own echoing lies for company. In a final frantic attempt to save his neck, Parry wrote a confession. It is a remarkable document, chaotic, self-pitying, and terrifyingly honest in parts. He wrote to Elizabeth, I have practiced with the Pope. I have practiced with the Jesuits. I have practiced with your enemies, but I never intended to hurt you. He tried to explain the complexity of his double life. He tried to explain that he was a man caught between two worlds, a man who had lost his moral compass in the service of the state. I am a man of no value, he wrote, but I have served you. It was a suicide note in the form of an apology. It confirmed everything the prosecution needed. He admitted to the intent, even if he denied the resolve. In the eyes of the law, compassing the death of the Queen was the crime. You didn't have to stab her, you just had to talk about it. The date for the trial was set, February 18th, 1585. Parry was moved from the Tower to Westminster Hall. The crowds gathered to see the monster. The ballads were already being printed in the streets, singing of the wicked traitor Parry. He entered the great hall. He looked at the judges. He saw Sir Christopher Hatton, the Queen's vice-chamberlain, staring at him with undisguised hatred. Parry made a calculation. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. Neville would testify. The letters were there. The confession was signed. He decided to gamble one last time. He would plead guilty. He thought that by submitting, by throwing himself on the mercy of the court, he might trigger the Queen's famous leniency. He thought he could charm the axe away. The clerk of the crown read the indictment. William Parry, art thou guilty of this high treason or not guilty? Parry stood up. He smoothed his doublet. He looked at the judges with a steady gaze. Guilty, he said. The courtroom buzzed. A guilty plea meant no trial. It meant immediate sentencing. Parry waited for the mercy. He waited for the judges to nod and say, "We shall recommend a pardon." Instead, the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Christopher Wray, did not hesitate. He placed the black cap upon his head. Sir Christopher Hatton looked down at the prisoner with eyes like flint. "William Parry," the judge intoned, "you have confessed to the most horrible, unnatural, and wicked treason. You are to be hanged, drawn, and quartered." The trap snapped shut. The master manipulator was now just meat. Parry snapped. "I deny it," Parry roared, his voice cracking with panic. "I am not guilty. I never intended to kill her. I only pleaded guilty to avoid the trial. I thought you would understand." He tried to unsay the plea. He tried to wrestle the words back into his mouth. He shouted that his confession was a lie, a strategic maneuver that had backfired. He demanded a trial. He demanded to cross-examine Sir Edmund Neville. He demanded to see the Queen. "I have the letter from the Pope," he yelled, grasping at straws. "I did it for the Queen. I am a double agent." It was a pathetic, terrifying spectacle. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the sophisticated intelligencer dissolved into a frightened, raving man. Sir Christopher Hatton silenced him with a voice like thunder. "Master Parry," he said, "you have confessed. The law has heard you. Your own hand has signed your death warrant. There is no going back." Parry continued to rant, his eyes darting around the room, looking for a friendly face, perhaps looking for Lord Burghley, who was notably absent. But there were no friends here. There were only the gears of the state grinding forward. He was dragged from the bar, still shouting, his heels scraping against the stone floor. He was not taken back to the comfortable lodgings he had enjoyed as a member of Parliament. He was thrown into the darkest cell of the tower, the place reserved for the dead men walking. The days between the sentencing and the execution were a torment of silence. For a narcissist like Parry, the worst punishment was not the physical deprivation, the cold stone, the bad food, the rats, but the irrelevance. He had spent his life needing to be the center of attention. Now he was alone. He spent his final days doing the only thing he knew how to do, writing. He wrote frantically to the Queen. These letters are the psychological debris of a collapsing mind. In one breath, he would beg for mercy, prostrating himself like a worm. "I am the most wretched man alive," he scrawled. "Spare me, and I shall crawl to the ends of the earth for you." In the next breath, he would turn arrogant, lecturing Elizabeth on her own safety. He offered to reveal great secrets if she would only grant him an audience. He hinted that there were other plotters, other assassins, and only he could stop them. It was the last con, the attempt to sell information he didn't have for a life he didn't deserve. "I know things," he wrote, the ink blotted with sweat or tears. "Things that touch your very person. Do not kill the only man who can save you." Elizabeth read the letters. We know this because they remain in the state papers. But she did not reply. To the Queen, Parry was no longer a person. He was a disappointment. She had given him everything: money, status, forgiveness for his past crimes. And he had repaid her by plotting her death with a bankrupt cousin in a garden. To Elizabeth, loyalty was binary. You were either true or you were false. Parry was false. The silence from the palace was the final verdict. Parry turned to his family. He wrote to his wife, the widow he had charmed and then ruined. He wrote to his stepdaughter, but they too were silent. He had squandered their fortunes on velvet doublets and Italian wine. He had dragged their names through the mud. They had nothing left to give him, not even pity. As the date of execution approached, March 2nd, 1585, Parry must have realized that the shape-shifting was over. There was no new persona to adopt. There was no Catholic exile or Protestant patriot left to play. There was only William ap Parry, the hungry boy from North Wales, about to die alone in a foreign city. The morning of March 2nd dawned with a gray, wet light. The Sheriff of London arrived at the Tower gates. He did not come with a carriage. He came with a hurdle. The hurdle was a crude wooden sled, a lattice of wicker and timber. It was the traditional conveyance for traitors. The condemned man was tied to it, lying on his back and dragged by a horse through the streets. It was designed to be humiliating. It symbolized the unmaking of the man. He was not worthy to walk on the earth. He was to be dragged through the filth of the gutter. Parry was brought out. He was dressed in his fine clothes, a nightgown of silk, and a velvet cap. Even at the end, he could not let go of the bravery. He wanted to look like a gentleman, even if he was dying like a dog. They tied him to the hurdle. The horse jerked forward. The journey from the Tower of London to the Palace Yard at Westminster was long. It took him through the heart of the city he had tried to conquer. The crowds lined the streets. Londoners loved an execution, but they hated a traitor. As Parry dragged past, the mud splashing into his face, the mob jeered. They threw filth. They shouted the verses of the ballads that were already circulating. William Parry, the wicked traitor. Parry lay on the sled looking up at the gray sky and the angry faces. Did he see the irony? He had wanted to be famous. He had wanted the whole city to know his name. Now they did. He had achieved his goal, but at the cost of his soul. The procession arrived at Westminster Palace Yard. The scaffold was waiting. It was a high platform, draped in black. Next to it stood the tools of the executioner's trade: the rope, the knife, the block, and the cauldron of boiling water. Most men, when they reach the foot of the ladder, collapse. They weep. They pray. They ask the crowd to pray for them. It is a moment of total surrender. William Parry argued. He was untied from the hurdle. He stood up, brushed the mud from his silk gown, and climbed the ladder with a strange, frantic energy. He looked out at the sea of faces, thousands of people packed into the yard. He was allowed to speak. This was the custom. The dying speech was supposed to be a confession, a warning to others to avoid sin. Parry turned it into a debate. "I am innocent," he shouted, his voice hoarse but loud. "I die a true servant of the Queen. I never intended her harm." The crowd rumbled with anger. A traitor who refused to confess was cheating them of their closure. The Sheriff of London, standing on the scaffold, interrupted him. "Master Parry, you have confessed. You pleaded guilty. Do not die with a lie on your lips." Parry spun around to face the sheriff. "I pleaded guilty to save my life. It was a legal trick. The law trapped me." He began to lecture the sheriff on the nuances of the case. He tried to explain the difference between talking about treason and committing treason. He cited his service in Venice. He cited the Pope's letter. "I am a doctor of laws," he cried. A lie. He was a doctor of nothing. "I know the statutes. You cannot hang a man for his thoughts." It was the ultimate absurdity. Here was a man with a noose around his neck, trying to filibuster his own execution. He was still trying to con the audience. He was still trying to win the argument. He refused to pray. When the chaplain stepped forward to offer comfort, Parry waved him away. I need no prayers from you, he sneered. I know my own heart. He cried out to the queen's palace, insisting on his loyalty, desperate for a reprieve that would never come. She knows, he screamed. She knows I have been loyal. The executioner grew tired of the performance. The crowd was getting restless. They were starting to throw stones. The theater had gone on too long. Turn him off, the sheriff ordered. Parry was still talking, still arguing, still explaining his innocence when the executioner shoved him off the ladder. The rope snapped tight, but the mercy of the long drop, which breaks the neck instantly, was not for traitors. Parry was strangled. He hung there, kicking and thrashing, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging. He was allowed to hang for a minute, perhaps two, just enough to render him unconscious, but not enough to kill him. Then, the executioner cut the rope. Parry fell to the wooden deck of the scaffold with a heavy thud. He was gasping, choking, the air rushing back into his lungs. He was alive. This was the drawing part of the sentence. The executioner and his assistant stripped the silk gown from his body. Parry lay naked on the boards, dazed and helpless. The executioner took a sharp knife. With a practiced motion, he sliced open Parry's belly from the sternum to the groin. The shock of the pain likely revived Parry fully. Historical accounts suggest the victims would often writhe in agony or gasp desperately as the blade did its work. The executioner reached into the body cavity. He pulled out the bowels. He held them up to the crowd, steaming in the cold air. Then he threw them into the cauldron of fire that was burning nearby. The smell of burning flesh filled the palace yard. Finally, the executioner reached up into the chest. He found the heart. He tore it out. He held the dripping organ aloft. "Behold the heart of a traitor," he shouted. Only then did the light finally fade from the eyes of William Parry. The hunger was gone. The ambition was extinguished. The shapeshifter was finally fixed in one form: dead meat. The body was chopped into 4 quarters. The head was severed and dipped in tar to preserve it. It was placed on a spike on Westminster Hall, the very building where Parry had screamed his denial. It stared out over the city of London, a grim gargoyle warning the next generation of ambitious young men. Parry had wanted to be noticed. He had wanted to be part of the history of the realm. And now he was. He was part of the architecture of the state's vengeance. The physical destruction of William Parry was total. The heart was burned, the body quartered, the head dipped in tar. The state had performed its ritual of purification, erasing the traitor from the book of life. But while the man was gone, the questions he raised remained. As the smoke cleared over Palace Yard, the poets and the pamphleteers began to pick over the bones of his reputation. They sought to understand how a man could be so many things at once and, in the end, be nothing at all. The smoke from the executioner's fire at Westminster Palace Yard drifted over the Thames, carrying the acrid scent of burnt flesh into the city. The body of William Parry, once the Member of Parliament for Queenborough, was now a collection of meat distributed to the 4 gates of London. The immediate reaction in London was not horror, but relief, mixed with a strange kind of mockery. The Elizabethans were accustomed to treason. They had seen the Northern Earls rise in 1569. They had seen the Ridolfi plot of 1571. They had seen the Throckmorton plot of 1583. But those were serious men with serious armies or serious ideologies. William Parry was different. He was a joke that had turned lethal. Within days of his death, the printing presses of Fleet Street were churning out broadsheets and ballads. The most famous of these was a satirical poem that captured the public's verdict on Parry's life. It did not paint him as a monster of the deep like the Jesuits. but as a shallow, vain fool who had played with fire. The verses were sung in taverns. It was pity/one, so witty/malcontent, /leaving reason /should to treason /so be bent, / but his gifts /were but shifts, /void of grace, / and his bravery /was, but knavery /vile and base. The word bravery here is crucial. In Tudor slang, it meant showiness, ostentation, the dressing up of a thing to look better than it is. The poet was saying that Parry's entire life, his clothes, his travels, his spycraft, was just costume jewelry. It glittered, but it wasn't gold. The government used Parry's death to tighten the screws, the bond of association, a terrifying legal document that obliged all signatories to hunt down and kill anyone who attempted to harm the Queen, was ratified by Parliament. Parry became the poster child for the necessity of this bond. He proved that the danger to Elizabeth wasn't just from foreign armies, but from the smiling man in the velvet doublet standing next to you in the privy chamber. And what of the Queen herself? Elizabeth I was not a woman given to public introspection about the men she killed. She moved on quickly. But the betrayal of William Parry must have stung. She had broken her own rules for him. She was notoriously stingy with money, yet she had given him a pension. She was wary of men with pasts, yet she had pardoned a convicted burglar. She had laughed at his stories of duping the Pope. She had allowed him to kiss her hand. Parry's treason was a personal insult to her judgment. It proved that her famous intuition, her ability to read the hearts of men, had a blind spot. She had mistaken a narcissist for a patriot. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but psychologically true, that in the weeks following Parry's execution, the Queen became more withdrawn. She trusted fewer people. The Parry affair contributed to the darkening mood of the late 1580s. The joyous, flirtatious atmosphere of the early reign was gone, replaced by a siege mentality. If a man like Parry, a man she had raised from the dust, could look her in the eye and plot her death, then who could be trusted? The shadow of the axe fell longer across the court. Why is William Parry not as famous as Guy Fawkes or Anthony Babington? Fawkes is burned in effigy every year. Babington is remembered as the romantic fool who doomed Mary, Queen of Scots. But Parry is largely a footnote. The reason lies in the nature of his crime. Fawkes had gunpowder. Babington had a secret cipher and a network of young aristocrats. Parry had nothing. He had no weapon. He had no co-conspirators except the reluctant Neville. He had no plan beyond a vague idea of doing something great. His treason was almost entirely theoretical. He was executed not for what he did, but for what he was, a man without a center. He wasn't driven by a burning hatred of Protestantism. He wasn't driven by a love for the Pope. He was driven by the need to be important. He is the patron saint of the modern con artist. He reminds us that the most dangerous people in history are often not the true believers, but the empty vessels. The true believer has a code. You can predict what they will do. The empty vessel takes the shape of whatever container you pour it into. Parry was a Protestant in London, a Catholic in Paris, a spy in Venice, and a martyr in the Tower. He was everything and nothing. It is fitting that Parry died arguing. Most traitors try to make a good end. They embrace the script of repentance. They accept that the state has the right to kill them, even if they disagree with the verdict. By dying well, they hope to salvage some dignity. Parry refused the script. He argued with the sheriff. He argued with the executioner. He argued with the crowd. To the very last second of his consciousness, he believed he could talk his way out of reality. He died as he lived, in a state of high-stakes improvisation. His tragedy was that he never understood the difference between the stage and the world. On a stage, you can change your costume and become a new character. In the world, your actions leave scars. You cannot unburgle a house. You cannot unwrite a letter to the Pope. You cannot unsay a treasonous thought. William Parry spent his life trying to edit his own story, but the executioner's axe is the ultimate editor. Cuts the story short, whether you are finished speaking or not. William Parry showed the Catholics a penitent son. He showed the Protestants a loyal spy. He showed the Queen a charming rogue. He showed his wives a wealthy gentleman. He was a mirror. And like a mirror, when you smash it, there is nothing behind the glass. In the end, the only thing that was real about William Parry was his death. The pain on the butcher's block was not a performance. The fire that burned his heart was not a metaphor. His head remained on the spike at Westminster for years, weather-beaten and picked clean by birds, a silent skull grinning down at the politicians and the lawyers rushing into the hall. If it could speak, it would perhaps offer one final piece of advice to the ambitious young men of London. Be careful what you pretend to be, for in the end, you are what you pretend to be.